One second, it was just a game of fetch. The next, a gunshot, a scream, a neighborhood demanding justice. The sun hung lazily over Bakersfield, California, casting long golden shadows across the quiet neighborhood. It was one of those afternoons that felt like it could stretch on forever, where time moved slower and worries felt a little further away. 12-year-old Malik Carter sat cross-legged on the front lawn, rolling a scuffed tennis ball between his fingers. His best friend, a towering German shepherd named Shadow, sat a few feet away, ears perked, waiting for the throw. Malik grinned, his fingers tightening around the ball before hurling it across the yard. Shadow bolted. He was fast, cutting through the air like a bullet, paws barely making a sound against the grass. Malik laughed, watching as the dog expertly snatched the ball midair before trotting back with his tail wagging. Across the street, Mrs. Douglas, an older woman with a bad knee and a nosy streak, watched from her porch, her lips pressed into a thin line. Shadow was big, bigger than most dogs in the neighborhood, and that made some people uncomfortable. Malik didn't care. Shadow was family, loyal, smart, his protector. "Good boy," Malik said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. The dog sat beside him, panting softly, still gripping the ball between his teeth. A breeze rolled through the block, rustling the branches of the magnolia trees lining the sidewalk. It was peaceful. But peace doesn't last long in some neighborhoods. Down the street, a black and white police cruiser slowed to a crawl. Officer Daniels, a man whose uniform looked a little too tight across the chest, squinted through the windshield. His radio crackled, some vague complaint about a dangerous-looking man loose in the neighborhood. He sighed, reaching for his coffee before realizing it was already empty. His shift had been long, too long. He just wanted to go home. But then he saw it, a big black shawl. Running, Daniels narrowed his eyes, his fingers flexed against the steering wheel. The next few seconds would change everything. But Malik had no idea. The tennis ball slipped from Malik's fingers, bouncing once on the sidewalk before rolling onto the street. Shadow was already moving. His paws thudded softly against the pavement as he chased after it, his tongue lolling out in excitement. It was routine, just another game. Malik didn't think twice, but Officer Daniels did. The police cruiser came to a sharp stop. The engine hummed, but inside the car, the officer's pulse hammered louder. He had seen it before. A big pine running full speed, teeth bared. At least that's what he thought he saw. His training kicked in. His instincts took over. The door swung open and Daniels moved fast. A hand on his holster, a foot on the curb, a heartbeat skipping ahead of reality. "Stop!" Daniels barked, voice cutting through the air like a whip. But Shadow wasn't stopping. Not because he was charging, because he didn't understand. The neighbors watching from their porches did. Malik did. The boy's face twisted, realization slamming into him like a freight train. "No, he's just getting his ball." Mrs. Douglas was already on her feet. A few houses down, a man watering his lawn dropped his hose. People knew what was about to happen before it even happened. Malik ran forward, arms flailing, his voice breaking with desperation. "He's not dangerous, please." Daniels heard the yelling, but his mind had already made its decision. He saw threat before he saw truth. His gun was out. His finger curled around the trigger. And then, boom, the shot tore through the quiet afternoon like a bolt of lightning. Birds scattered from the telephone wires. The sound echoed, bouncing off houses, rattling windows. Shadow's body jerked mid-stride. He didn't understand what happened. 1 second, he was running. The next, pain ripped through his side. His legs buckled. His momentum carried him forward before he collapsed onto the pavement. Malik screamed, a sound too raw for a child to make. A sound that made stomachs clench and hearts break. The tennis ball rolled to a stop near Shadow's limp paw. Malik dropped to his knees beside his dog, hands hovering over the wound, unsure of what to do. Shadow's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. His warm brown eyes flickered up to the boy he had spent his whole life protecting. His tail thumped weakly against the ground. The whole street stood still. Officer Daniels' gun was still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His chest heaved. His mind was still catching up to his actions. But it was too late. Cell phones were out. Neighbors recorded. Witnesses whispered. Someone muttered, "He wasn't even aggressive." Another voice, shaky with anger, said, "That boy just lost his dog for nothing." Daniels finally lowered his gun. He looked around, suddenly aware of all the eyes on him. But one set of eyes burned hotter than the rest. The front door of the Carter house swung open, and out stepped a man who had seen more than his fair share of violence. Terrence Carter moved like a storm. He wasn't running, but every step toward his son felt heavier, like the ground itself knew what was coming. Special Agent Carter wasn't just any father. He was a man trained to remain calm in the face of chaos. But right now, he wasn't calm. He was furious. The moment he saw Malik kneeling over Shadow's bloody fur, something in him cracked. His son, his baby boy, was holding onto his dog like he could somehow will him back to life. Malik's face was wet with tears, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, he shot him." The boy's fingers trembled as he touched Shadow's chest, feeling the slow, uneven rise and fall. The dog was still alive, but just barely. Carter knelt beside them, one large hand resting gently on his son's back. "Keep talking to him, Malik. Keep him awake." His voice was low, steady, but behind it was something dangerous. Then he looked up, and Officer Daniels took a step back. The badge clipped to Carter's belt caught the afternoon sun. The gold letters on his FBI credentials were impossible to miss. "You just shot my son's dog." Carter's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of it alone was enough. "Do you even know what you've done?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Sir, holster your weapon." The officer's fingers twitched at the command, his brain catching up to what was happening. His authority in this situation had just vanished. Neighbors edged closer, their cameras rolling. Daniels hesitated. "Sir, the dog was—" "You didn't even think." Carter's voice was sharp now. "A child's dog, running for a ball. That's what you saw, and you still pulled the trigger." Daniel's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked around, searching for an ally, but all he found were faces full of anger and disbelief. Malik let out a broken sob. "Dad, he's getting colder." Carter turned his attention back to his son, pressing a firm hand to Shadow's wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, warm and thick. The dog whined softly, his breathing uneven. "Hold on, buddy," Carter murmured, his jaw tightening. "You're going to be okay." Then, without looking up, he barked another order. "Call animal control, now!" For a second, Daniels didn't move. Then stiffly, he reached for his radio. His voice was shakier than before. "This is Officer Daniels. I need emergency veterinary services at my location." The world around them was too quiet, the kind of silence that comes right before an explosion. Carter took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay focused. His son needed him. His dog needed him. But right now, the weight of something bigger hung in the air. Daniels had made a mistake, and he was finally starting to understand that it wasn't going away. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Neighbors stepped off their porches, inching closer, phones held high. Some whispered in hushed voices. Others didn't bother. He shot that dog for no reason. "Malik's just a kid, man. He had to watch that happen." What if his father wasn't FBI? Would we even be standing here having this conversation? Officer Daniels stood frozen, his hand hovering near his holster like he wasn't sure if he should be reaching for it or hiding it. His radio crackled, dispatch confirming that animal control was on the way. But it wasn't just about Shadow anymore. People weren't just watching an injured dog. They were watching power shift. Carter stood, blood on his hands, his dog's blood. But his presence alone was enough to make Daniels uncomfortable. "This is what happens, huh?" Carter's voice was calm, but it cut through the murmurs around them. "A boy plays with his arm, and you see a threat." Daniels flinched. "Sir, I was responding to a call." "A call?" Carter took a step closer. Daniels took a step back. "From who?" Daniels hesitated. Carter let the moment stretch. He already knew. Someone saw a black kid with a big dog and got scared. That was it. That was all it took. A sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Mrs. Douglas." "I saw everything," she said, her cane pressing into the sidewalk. "That dog wasn't aggressive. He wasn't charging. He was just running." Daniels opened his mouth. "Don't lie," she snapped. "I'm old, not blind." A few neighbors chuckled under their breath, but the anger in their voices was still thick. Carter turned to the growing crowd. How many of you saw what happened? Nearly every hand went up. Daniel's throat bobbed. The sweat on his forehead was visible now. A young woman in a UCLA hoodie took a step forward, her phone still recording. This isn't just about a dog. She gestured to Malik, who was rocking back and forth, fingers tangled in Shadow's fur. That boy has to live with this for the rest of his life. You think he'll ever forget the sound of that shot? Daniel's face flashed red. Carter stared him down. If he was a white kid, would Shadow still be alive? Daniel's lips parted, but there was no good answer. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Animal control. Maybe another squad car. Maybe the media. This wasn't over. Not even close. The sirens grew louder, but they weren't the only thing closing in. A second patrol car rolled up, its tires crunching against the pavement. The officer inside, Sergeant Reynolds, stepped out, eyes flicking between Daniels, Carter, and the growing crowd. He took in the scene fast. The dog bleeding, the boy shattered, the phones in the air. Then his gaze landed on Carter's badge. Agent Carter, Reynolds greeted, measured. He already knew this wasn't just another call. Carter's voice was sharp. This officer discharged his weapon on an innocent animal. My son's dog. Reynolds turned to Daniels. His face was tight. You shoot the dog? Daniels nodded stiffly. I thought it was attacking. You thought? Carter's voice was low, controlled. Did you even wait to see? Reynolds didn't look at Daniels right away. He looked at the crowd, at the faces that weren't just angry anymore, but expecting something. Because too many times they'd seen nothing happen. A voice from the back, an older man with gray at his temples, spoke up. What happens now? Because if that was one of us who pulled a gun and fired, we'd already be in cuffs. Reynolds knew the weight of that statement. He ran a hand over his jaw before turning back to Daniels. Hand over your firearm. Daniels froze. Sarge, That's an order. Slowly, painfully, Daniels unclipped his holster. He set his weapon in Reynolds' waiting palm. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. Others exchanged looks. Finally, something was happening, but it wasn't enough. Malik still sat beside Shadow. His little hands pressed into the fur he'd hugged 1,000 times before. Except this time it was soaked with blood. The animal control van pulled up, and 2 workers stepped out, moving quickly toward the injured dog. Malik tensed, but Carter rested a firm, reassuring hand on his shoulder. They're gonna help him, son. Malik barely breathed as they lifted Shadow onto a stretcher. The dog whimpered, a weak, heartbreaking sound. Is he gonna make it? Malik's voice was barely above a whisper. Carter couldn't promise him that. One of the workers, a young woman with kind eyes, met Malik's gaze. We're gonna do everything we can. They loaded Shadow into the back of the van. Malik's small fingers curled into his father's sleeve. Can we follow them? He asked. Carter didn't hesitate. Yeah, we're going. But before he turned, he leveled one last look at Daniels. You took something from my son today, he said, voice calm but full of something lethal. And whether or not he gets his dog back, he'll never get back the trust you stole. Daniels had no words. He just stood there as the weight of what he'd done finally settled in. But the community wasn't done, because this wasn't just about a dog. This was about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets a bullet. And the whole world was watching now. The car ride to the emergency vet was silent. Malik sat in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping his hoodie sleeves, his eyes locked on the van ahead of them. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just waiting. Carter gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. He had seen a lot of ugly things in his life, investigated cases that still haunted him, but nothing prepared him for the sound of his son screaming over his dying dog. When they reached the clinic, Malik jumped out before the car fully stopped. He ran inside, breathless, just as the workers wheeled Shadow toward the back. Wait, can I stay with him? The receptionist gave him a soft smile. Not yet, sweetheart, but we'll keep you updated. Malik nodded, barely blinking. Carter rested a hand on his shoulder, and so they waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then finally, the vet walked out. Malik shot to his feet. Is he? He's stable, the vet said. The bullet missed his vital organs. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong. The weight in Malik's chest collapsed. His legs buckled, but Carter caught him before he hit the floor. His son buried his face in his father's chest. "He's okay?" Carter's hand cradled the back of his head. "Yeah, buddy, he's okay." For the first time in hours, Malik breathed. But outside of that clinic, the world kept moving. The video of Shadow's shooting had gone viral. News stations were picking up the story. Officer Daniels had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department had no choice, not with the public watching. But the biggest question remained: would there be real consequences? Carter knew how these things went. He knew Daniels would claim he was following protocol. He knew there'd be people defending him. But he also knew something had changed. This time, the world wasn't looking away, and neither was Malik. As they left the clinic, his son looked up at him, eyes full of something new. Not just relief, not just pain, understanding. "Dad," Malik said softly, "if you weren't FBI, do you think they would have done anything?" Carter didn't answer right away. He looked out at the street, where cars passed by, where life kept moving like nothing had happened. Then he looked at his son, the little boy who had to grow up a little faster today. "No," he said honestly, "they wouldn't have." Malik nodded once. He wasn't a little kid anymore. Carter squeezed his shoulder. "That's why we fight, son, so that one day they don't get to choose who matters." And as they drove home, Malik reached into his pocket, pulled out Shadow's ball. The game wasn't over. It was just on pause. How many times does a life, any life, have to be taken or nearly taken before someone is held accountable? How many Maliks are out there watching something they love be destroyed for no reason? And the hardest question of all, what if this family didn't have power? Would anyone have cared? This isn't just about one dog, one officer, one mistake. It's about a system where some people don't get second chances, where fear pulls the trigger before reason ever steps in. And that has to change. If you believe in accountability, in justice, in making sure no child has to go through what Malik did, share this story. Talk about it. Make sure the right people are watching. Because silence is how these stories disappear. And this one, it won't.